tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Imagine a simple bag of potatoes, the most ordinary kind you would buy at the supermarket. Now imagine that this bag has become the center of an international trade dispute that could affect restaurant prices, the policies of the Canadian Prime Minister, and even the stability of the US economy. Sounds absurd, but this is the reality of 2025.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
In just 3 months, Canada reduced potato shipments to the US by 140,000 tons. This is not a miscalculation, it is a real economic shock that was not announced, explained, or even officially acknowledged. Trucks stopped crossing the border, warehouses emptied, and cold storage facilities in southern Canada began to shut down. All this happened without a single press release. No loud statements, just numbers, and they don't lie.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
While Canadian farmers are cutting back on crops en masse and processing plants are cutting orders, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is signing a multi-billion-dollar agreement to supply agricultural products to Asia. The flow that has been heading south for decades is now turning east.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Japan, Indonesia, South Korea, new markets, new conditions, new rules of the game. Why is Canada turning away from the US? What silent war is unfolding on the border when it's not about oil or technology, but potatoes?
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
The answer came in April 2025, when the White House unexpectedly imposed sharp import tariffs, hitting not only Canada but also its own market. A 25% additional duty meant that the usual frozen fries, which used to cost $3.50, now cost $5.25. People began to complain. Small cafes are losing customers. Large chains are removing potato dishes from their menus.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
But it's not just about food. It's a signal. The Canadian agricultural industry, which has been geared toward American consumers for decades, is beginning to reorient itself. And although this process is still quiet, it could bring down the familiar economic architecture of the entire continent. This video is not just a story about the rising price of fries. It is a story about cracks in an economic union that until recently was considered unbreakable, about new alliances, strategies, and sacrifices. Because in 2025, even potatoes could become a weapon of geoeconomics.
10. That's a good one. Yeah.
Stay with us. You'll find out why one unofficial move by Canada could spell the beginning of the end for the old trade order between the two countries, and how, against the backdrop of a trade war with China, the US risks losing its last reliable neighbor.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
In the spring of 2025, the Canadian-American border, usually bustling with agricultural products, suddenly emptied. What began as a technical tariff adjustment as part of the White House's internal reform quickly turned into an economic rift.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
It all started with a seemingly insignificant fact. In a single quarter, Canadian potato shipments to the US fell by more than 140,000 tons. That's about 40% of the usual volume. But the most alarming thing was that there was no official explanation from Ottawa. No memoranda, no new decrees, not even a comment in the press. It looked as if Canada had simply turned off the tap quietly, without any fuss. In warehouses in New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, workers who usually load containers weighing 20 tons received sudden orders to freeze shipments until further notice. Potato processing plants cut shifts, cargo piled up at logistics centers, and in some places, refrigeration units were even turned off simply because there was nothing left to cool.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
This was not an isolated case. A former employee of a logistics company in Alberta, who wished to remain anonymous, said that back in March they received internal instructions to prepare for a complete shutdown of exports to the US amid political instability and expected tough retaliatory regulation from Washington. Some agricultural cooperatives even began terminating contracts with American retailers in advance, suspecting that the situation would only worsen. At the same time, closed-door meetings were taking place in the Canadian government's offices, discussing not only the fate of potato shipments, but also the prospect of a complete overhaul of the agricultural export model, which was focused exclusively on its southern neighbor. It was at this moment that Canada realized that its economic dependence on the US was a strategic vulnerability. The American market, which had been considered a sure thing for decades, suddenly became unpredictable. Everything changed on April 2nd, when Washington imposed large-scale trade restrictions without prior discussion with its neighbors. The new package of tariffs affected dozens of product categories, including potatoes, seed material, and processed products such as fries, mashed potatoes, and dried potatoes. The total burden reached 35%. 25% in sanctions duties imposed under the Priority Domestic Agricultural Program, and another 10% in basic import taxes. According to the White House press secretary, the tariff was intended to support American farmers and restore balance after decades of trade concessions. But in reality, instead of support, the American market has been hit with shortages and inflation. A typical shipment of 25 tons of frozen French fries, which used to cost about $32,000, now costs $43,000, including logistics, insurance, and customs clearance. One bag of potatoes, which a restaurant used to buy for $22, now sells for $30. An $8 price increase may not seem like a disaster, but if a restaurant goes through 20 or 30 bags a day, that's a significant hole in the budget of a small establishment. In a cafe in Minnesota, a chef told reporters that he had been forced to completely abandon Canadian potatoes and switch to local ones, but the quality suffered so much that regular customers began to complain about the taste. The fries were watery, poorly cooked, and some batches had black spots. Within 2 weeks, the restaurant's revenue fell by 18% and 2 waiters were laid off. The problem was not limited to restaurants. Supermarket chains began to see price increases for potato products ranging from 12% to 35%, depending on the state and logistical distance. Analysts from the North Dakota Department of Food and Agriculture published a forecast that if the trend continues until the end of the year, potatoes could become the new milk product that is on the list of essentials but with a significantly higher price. This is no joke. In April-June 2025, the price of potato chips rose by an average of 17%, frozen potato wedges by 21%, potatoes by 14%. Meanwhile, equally dramatic changes were taking place in Canada. Due to a sharp reduction in contracts with processing companies, farmers in PEI and Alberta began to urgently revise their agricultural plans. One farmer, John Brady from Summerside, told the local press that he had reduced his plantings by 40%. "We used to work for McCain. They guaranteed volumes. Now there's nothing. No contracts, no demand, too many risks." What's more, some farms, unable to find buyers, began sending surplus crops to feed livestock or, more tragically, destroying their stocks in storage. In one case in Manitoba, local authorities even organized the removal of more than 200 tons of potatoes for processing into biofuels simply to prevent them from rotting and contaminating the soil. But of all these consequences, the most alarming is not the rise in prices, the spoiled fries, or the drop in demand. The most alarming thing is the silence. Neither side has made an official statement about what is happening. Canada has not acknowledged that it is cutting exports. The US has not announced that it is preparing for a new round of trade battles. Everything is happening quietly, almost imperceptibly, but empty warehouses, frozen supply chains, rising prices, and disappearing products from menace speak for themselves. This is not a crisis that erupted overnight. It is a rift that has been building for years, and potatoes, that humble and familiar product, have become its first symptom. While potato shipments to the US have virtually stopped, an internal restructuring has begun in Canada itself. Farmers left without their previous contracts with McCain and Cavendish, which for decades bought their harvest in bulk and shipped it abroad, have begun to look for new solutions. The familiar system where all logistics were geared toward transit exports to the US began to crumble, but confusion was replaced by cold pragmatism. Some cooperatives in Prince Edward Island quickly realized that without a stable foreign buyer, they would have to focus on the domestic market, and they took action. In May 2025, an emergency meeting of representatives from 26 farms and processing plants was held in Charlottetown. Within 24 hours, they signed a memorandum on reorienting supplies from export to domestic sales. One of the key points was the launch of packaging in 5-kilogram retail packages instead of the traditional 20-ton containers. This decision had an immediate effect. Supermarkets began to actively purchase products at reduced prices and sell locally grown potatoes without intermediaries. The shelf price even dropped slightly, from $4.99 to $4.50 per package. For consumers, this seemed like a small thing, but on a national scale, it was an important economic and political gesture. Canadian potatoes are staying at home. Even more important was that the freed-up volume began to be directed to social programs. In Manitoba, Alberta, and New Brunswick, with the support of the Federal Food Security Agency, Initiatives were launched to purchase surplus produce from farmers at a fixed subsidized price and redistribute it to free meal programs, food banks, and school cafeterias. These programs not only saved farmers from losses, but also began to address another problem: rising poverty amid general inflation. In some areas, such as Moncton and St. John's, the population gained stable access to fresh vegetables without price increases for the first time in years. One of the coordinators of the Food for Every Home project even stated that for the first time in a long time, potatoes are no longer an export commodity and are once again part of the family table. Local processors also got involved. In Alberta, a small frozen potato pancake factory switched to a 24-hour schedule after signing a direct contract with a chain of local stores in 3 provinces. Processing volume increased by 38%, and 17 new employees were hired. A similar story unfolded in Saskatchewan, where a new sorting center opened in June. Its launch had been impossible until the market was flooded with cheap American products. Now it is the Canadian domestic market that has become the driver of growth. However, Ottawa's main bet was not on this. It was made on the East. While Washington was putting up barriers, Prime Minister Carney seized the moment to shift Canada's agricultural strategy toward Asia. Since early 2025, delegations from the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of International Trade have visited Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Indonesia. For the first time in decades, these visits were not routine. They were followed by real deals. In June, an agreement was signed to supply frozen potatoes to Tokyo worth $46 million, with the prospect of doubling volumes over the next 3 years. In Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim country, an agreement was reached on regular supplies of organic potatoes from Manitoba, a product certified to halal standards, which had not previously been practiced in the country at all. South Korea has emerged as an unexpected winner in this geoeconomic shift. Although the country still bans imports of fresh potatoes for health reasons, the market for semi-finished and processed products has been opened up. McCain quickly adapted. In collaboration with a Korean distributor, it launched a new line of frozen snow potato balls specially adapted to local tastes. In the first 2 months, the product ranked 4th in sales in the frozen vegetable segment in supermarkets in Seoul and Busan. But Indonesia attracted the most interest. With a population of over 275 million and rapid urbanization, the country proved to be an almost ideal consumer. In 2024, exports from PEI to Indonesia totaled just $8 million. By July 2025, this figure had already exceeded $21 million. There were even plans to build a temporary warehouse and logistics hub in Java to serve regional orders without delay. At the same time, negotiations began on direct subsidies for small Canadian farmers to enable them to upgrade their equipment to meet Asian sanitary requirements. For the first time in a long time, export development began to affect not only giants like McCain, but also medium-sized farmers. Nevertheless, this expansion was accompanied by difficulties. High shipping costs, long routes, and a lack of refrigeration capacity all held back potential. In addition, dependence on large corporations remained a sore point. One Alberta farmer told CBC in an interview, "We are trading one dependency for another. We used to work for the US, now we work for Asia, but the middlemen are the same." Ottawa, for its part, insists that diversification is not a replacement but an expansion. The Ministry of International Trade claims that more than 25 countries already purchase Canadian potato. These include not only traditional partners such as Panama and Dominica, but also new players such as Uruguay, Guatemala, and even Rwanda. This is no longer a spontaneous reaction to tariffs, it is a strategic restructuring of the entire export architect. For Canadian consumers, such changes are not always noticeable. Prices on supermarket shelves remain stable, although the choice of varieties is growing and more local brands are appearing. For farmers, this is a chance to restore their income and shift to a more sustainable model. And for Ottawa, it is a rare opportunity to demonstrate that even in the midst of a trade war, and without direct confrontation, it is possible to outmaneuver an old economic partner while preserving both jobs and strategic autonomy. Against the backdrop of Canada's sharp shift toward Asian markets and weakening trade ties with the US, a new and more troubling reality is emerging in North America. The US food and agricultural industries, which for decades had relied on stable and cheap imports from the north, found themselves facing a protracted crisis. Domestically, supply chains began to falter and traditional business models collapsed under the pressure of new tariffs, inflation, and a lack of substitute imports. Questions began to be asked more and more often: had America become a hostage to its own protectionist policies? While new export agreements with Japan and Indonesia were being signed in Toronto, restaurateurs, distributors, and even national fast food chains in Minnesota were forced to revise their menus. One striking example is a franchise with more than 300 outlets across the Midwest, which was forced to remove potato side dishes from its menu for 3 months, replacing them with rice and corn tortillas. The reason was unstable supplies and unpredictable prices. Contracts with Canadian suppliers have been terminated, American farmers are unable to keep up with deliveries, and the quality of new products cannot compete. The potatoes darken quickly, lose their crispness, and, according to a chef from Wisconsin, feel like they're from the 90s, when everything was fried in old oil and no one paid attention to the temperature.